Thanks for coming to my presentation today. Well, we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, if that works for you. Let's start off by looking at a couple of things, a couple of images. I want you to think about what you see when you see this image. Think about what things you might see in this image. And how about this one? What do you see here? And then finally, what do you see in this image? Well, I'm guessing that you probably saw a couple of different things in these images. And why is that? What's going on here? Well, our mind plays tricks on us to make us feel comfortable in the world around us as quickly as possible. Simply put, our mind plays tricks on us, right? And then sometimes our brain jumps to conclusions about things quickly, like this here. Maybe we see a washing machine and maybe we see a goofy looking face. It jumps to conclusions even if it might be wrong conclusions. So I'm guessing that you saw a couple of things again, and like what you see here, maybe you see an upside down bathtub, and maybe you also see an animal-like figure with 4 legs in the air, which is known as the pareidolia effect. Now that's kind of a big word, so I'm going to repeat it again so that you know how to pronounce it. Again, that is the pareidolia effect. And pareidolia is when people see patterns or inanimate objects or subliminal messages in something else. Pareidolia is an example of a cognitive bias, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So before I begin, let me just briefly tell you about who I am. My name is Jen Blatz, and I'm a user experience researcher and designer at Fidelity Investments. I also co-founded a couple of UX groups in the Dallas area, including IXDA and UX Research and Strategy, which you can see all over the web. Check it out. Okay, enough about me. Let's move on, back to the main topic. First, let me say that I do not come from a psychology background, and this is really important to emphasize. I tell you this because I don't want you to think that this is going to be some stuffy or highly academic talk. No way. I also want you to understand that people outside of psychology, like UX designers, product owners, developers, and so on, can also benefit from knowing a little bit about cognitive biases. Why? Well, because we all have them. What I hope to help you with today is to show you some ways to identify cognitive bias in yourself and in others. That really is the first step. Being aware of cognitive biases can help you keep them from creeping into your work. So today I'm going to talk about a few things. First, I'm going to give you a high-level definition of what cognitive bias means. Then I'm going to talk about what to look for in yourself and in others to recognize what cognitive bias looks like. Then I'm going to talk about some ways that you can fight them off. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some ways that you can actually use cognitive biases to your advantage. Yes, you can even use them for good. So let's start with the basics. What is cognitive bias? Well, according to Wikipedia, a cognitive bias is a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality and judgment. What? Like I said before, it's a way the brain plays tricks on us by jumping to conclusions about the world around us. It's mental shortcuts. We can't help it. The brain just does it without us knowing. All right, so now we know what it is, but why do we care? I'm assuming most of us here on the meeting are not psychologists. Maybe you were in a past life, I don't know, but I'm going to assume that most people attending are involved in technology or UX or product in some way. So why should we care? Well, as a user experience professional, whether that be a designer or a researcher or even a product partner, we all know how important it is to test our designs with users, right? In doing so, we must be very careful to not bias our tests or research by leading the witness. And when I say lead the witness, I mean asking questions in a biased way that might cause a person to answer based more on the way we ask the question rather than their genuine answer. So being aware of how you might do that, however unintentionally, is key to a successful usability test or research study, or even when we're working with team members to solve a problem. If we can recognize a cognitive bias to be a problem and be aware of the signs, then we can fight the urge to fall down that dark hole, and we can help others from doing the same. Now, let's start off with some of the cognitive biases we're going to talk about today and how they might creep into our professional world. And we might as well start off with the most important person in the room, and that's you. We always seem to think we're immune from the problems and flaws of others, don't we? Well, blind spot bias happens when we see ourselves as less biased than others. We're also displaying blind spot bias when we eagerly point out the cognitive biases in other people, rather than acknowledging them in ourselves. The key thing to know here about blind spot bias is that everyone is affected by it. Sure, people are motivated to view themselves in a positive light. It's natural, but we're no better than anybody else. So what does blind spot bias look like? Well, one sign is you don't accept advice from others. I've seen this so many times. Someone's ego gets in the way of admitting we might not know something. So what can we do to prevent blind spot bias? Well, first, like I've said, be aware that it happens to everyone. Don't think of yourself as above the law. In the user experience world, let's say you're conducting some sort of research, like a usability test. Well, make sure that you write down your discussion guide and have others review it. And when I say discussion guide, I mean like a moderator's guide, or this is kind of your plan for research. It includes things like the tasks you're going to have the users perform, your research goals, and the questions that you might be asking the participant. Have someone else review that discussion guide and make sure that you take their advice if they have some ways that it could be improved upon. Like, for example, maybe removing some leading questions. If you find yourself resisting help, you might want to take another look at yourself, Mr. Blind Spot Bias. Okay, let's take a look at another cognitive bias known as the experimenter's bias. First, let me clarify something when I talk about an experimenter. I'm not talking about just official researchers or someone who, like what you see in this picture, someone who's running a scientific experiment in a lab. I'm talking about anybody who's doing research. Like maybe they're talking to users to build empathy, or to gain an understanding about a product, or interviewing others for information. I would consider us all an experimenter. What happens with experimenter bias is that the person conducting the usability tests or the research study tends to believe and share information that only agrees with his or her expectations. In other words, they promote and talk about the stuff that went well in the experience and the experiment, and maybe forgets to mention the other disagreeable stuff. So let me tell you a story. I was participating in some research at a financial company. We were sitting around tables and each of us had a role. We had an interviewer, facilitator, and a couple of note takers. And we had a participant sitting at the head of the table. So the participant was telling us about the last time she went to a dealership to buy a car. Now, from my experience and my understanding, a lot of people do not have a great experience when they go to a dealership to buy a car. It's just not a very fun day. So the participant started telling us about her last car buying experience, which was less than fabulous. And one of the note takers on the team didn't like what she was hearing from the participant. Instead of silently taking notes, like she was supposed to be doing, she interrupted her and said, "What? I've never heard anything like that happening at a dealership before. Are you sure that's what really happened?" Oh, yeah. I was shocked that she said that to the participant. This behavior is so wrong on so many levels. So how can you avoid experimenter's bias? One way to avoid such biased behavior is to use people as observers who have little or no stake in the outcome of the experiment. If they're not emotionally involved, then they won't care if you kill their darlings. But if a person on your team does have some involvement, make sure that you have clear rules and procedures in place for that research process. You need to remind that person that we are here to gather data and insights from our participants, not to share our own thoughts. Okay, so let's go one level deeper than the experimenter bias and talk about the observer expectancy effect. Think about that person that we just talked about who said, "Are you sure that's what really happened?" Think about how that question affected the participant through the rest of the interview. Yeah, I can assure you that it did. So this next cognitive bias, known as the observer expectancy effect, happens when a researcher subconsciously or unintentionally reacts to a participant's actions or what they say. When this happens, the researcher's actions then influences the participant of that research study. So what does this look like? It can be a surprise facial expression, like when a participant says something wrong in the designer's mind. Or it can be making noises like scoffs and sighs when a participant takes a wrong turn in a prototype. Let me just say, this is bad, bad, bad. If you're ever talking to users or stakeholders or partners on your team, and you're trying to seek some honest feedback, please think about how the observer expectancy effect can affect this conversation. So let me tell you another story. It was my first week on a new job at a company that owns a bunch of animal hospitals. I was asked to sit on a focus group video conference call to reveal a new design. The product owner, we'll call him Dennis because that's his name, addressed the crowd of over 50, that's 50 people on the call. That included veterinarian doctors and technicians. Dennis said to his innocent bystanders, "Here's the design for the new prescription search screen. Isn't it great? What do you guys think?" Oh, oh, it kind of went black for me after that. Isn't it great? What do you guys think? Well, I think Dennis had just stepped in a huge pile of observer expectancy bias. Needless to say, that format of a focus group chat didn't happen again on my watch. As a UX designer, you want your designs to succeed. I get it. You've poured your heart and soul into your design. You've pushed every pixel into that perfect position. But when your design goes in front of a user and you see them struggling to do the easiest thing on the planet, what are you supposed to do? You want to freak out. Well, you can't. But here's what you can do to avoid tainting the witness. Like I said before, if you can, get someone else to test your designs. Again, that other person is not emotionally invested and therefore are much less likely to react to feedback. that it's not in line with what the designer wants or expects. The major point I want you to take away with you when talking about the observer expectancy effect is to keep your body language and tone in check. You can even videotape yourself to see your subconscious clues that you might do in, say, an interview situation. If you notice these clues and you're made aware of them, then you can become more aware of your reactions and keep them more tame the next time. Okay, so we talked a lot about how we can detect cognitive biases in ourselves. Now let's talk about the idea a bit about how cognitive biases can affect our can affect how we perceive others compared to ourselves. Social comparison bias is the tendency to favor people who don't compete with our own strengths. You've heard the phrase opposites attract, right? Well, there's certainly some truth to that. I, for one, can't imagine being with somebody as chatty and obnoxious as myself. Humans are constantly evaluating themselves and others across a variety of ways, such as attractiveness, wealth, intelligence, success. We can't help it. Do you know something I do? Almost subconsciously. When I walk into a room of strangers, I look at a person's face and then I look at their left hand to see if they have a wedding band on. I do this for both men and women. I have no idea why. It's not like I'm on the prowl. I just almost instinctively or subconsciously look at a person's face and then their hand. This is my way of sizing people up. And when it comes to the UX world, even professionals size each other up so that they cannot try not to look bad. People worry about someone who's going to bump their designs off that proverbial pedestal. This is why stakeholders tell you, oh, they know what the user wants. Therefore, you don't need to do that research. Or this is why salespeople don't let you to have access to customers so that you can talk with them yourself. And this is why CEOs and product owners don't want you to test their designs and iterate on that product early. They say, oh, we'll just get it out, the feedback when we get it out there in the wild. So what can you do to prevent social comparison bias? Well, first, let's think about what we can do when we hire people for our team. And think about the diversity of those people. Look for people with different races, ages, religions, cultures, backgrounds, and locations to bring in that diverse perspective to our product. Think about what's happening now in Silicon Valley and how they're not really providing a diverse perspective because they all live in this little tech bubble. That area is not representative of the rest of the world. So when you are hiring for your team and you're looking at diversity, you are simply going to build better products because you have the advantage of having that diverse perspective brought in. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about things that don't agree with our mental models or our ideas. I have another fancy word for you. Are you ready? It is the Semmelweis Effect. Let me say that again. The Semmelweis Effect. And that is a cognitive bias where we have the tendency to reject evidence if it contradicts a paradigm. The term originated from the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a doctor who discovered that, wait for this, mortality rates or death rates fell 10 times when doctors washed their hands in between patients. and most particularly after an autopsy, and then going on to a live patient. It's pretty shocking, huh? Sure, washing your hands in between sick or even dead patients seems like a no-brainer now, but Semmelweis's hand-washing suggestions were rejected by his peers. I guess that every new process has to start sometime, right? So how does this cognitive bias relate to the non-medical world? Well, as we've seen in some previous examples, people already think they know best and they always think that they're right. It's hard to convince them that they're wrong. Old paradigms can be stubborn and very difficult to break. For some here in this meeting, this might have been the way that you check your email or to get on the internet or to do work or to have a personal calendar. For those who are not familiar with what this is an old Apple Macintosh computer. And then this guy came along, Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple, and he decided we needed a way to access all this stuff from our phone. Yeah, our phone. But this concept had been tried before and failed. And this is a picture of a Palm Pilot, which is an earlier personal digital assistant. In fact, other items had been created way before the iPhone, but they weren't successful. Why? Perhaps the people in the world were just not ready. Or should we say some people of the world were just not ready. And this is where the Semmelweis Effect kicks in. People are creatures of habit. We don't like change. But in order for things to be modern and new, we have to challenge the status quo. We have to be acceptive of innovation opportunities. So what will be your Semmelweis hand-washing moment? Okay, so have you ever heard someone come up to you with a problem to solve and you wondered how the competition was tackling that same problem? Yeah, it's pretty natural to wonder how other companies are solving that same issue, right? Well, maybe not always. The not invented here bias is where people don't want to accept information or ideas developed outside of their group. It's the classic, we don't need to know what that group is doing because it's probably not as good as our idea. Ugh. This is really frustrating to me. As a researcher and a designer, my first reaction when hearing about a new problem to solve is to figure out what already exists in the world. Why reinvent the wheel? When you look at what your competitor is doing, this is known as competitive benchmarking or competitive analysis. We look at other products to see what they're doing better. And maybe if they have some good features, we might want to borrow those and put them into our own product. Or we look to see what that other product sucks at. And then we make sure we don't want to borrow any of those ideas. So think about this. Have you ever had anybody, a stakeholder, tell you there's no need to go out and check the competition? I know I have. And it's really, really frustrating. So why does this happen? Well, I think there's a number of reasons that can contribute to the not invented here bias. But basically, it's the whole idea really stems from insecurity. When I'm first assigned to a new product to research or design, I love to start with comparing similar products. Again, partially so I can see what's out there and borrow the good stuff and not borrow the bad stuff. So I would encourage you to do the same. And also so that you avoid the not invented here cognitive bias. There's really no need to reinvent the wheel. So it's pretty common knowledge that people are social beings. Even the introverts in this call, and I know that there are some here today, do seek social interaction from time to time. So this next cognitive bias I'm going to talk about will focus on some of the things that we do as humans to fit in with the group. Have you ever bit your tongue? And no, I don't mean like when you're eating some food. What I mean is you bit your tongue when you wanted to say something in a group setting, but you were afraid that your opinion might be too different from other people in the group, so you don't say anything. Well, the courtesy bias is when you do not fully state your opinion once an opinion has been rolled out or stated by someone else in the group. Even if we don't agree with that opinion, we don't say anything because we don't want to offend others or we don't want to look bad in front of the group. It makes sense that you might not want to speak your true thoughts in front of others, right? You don't want to be embarrassed by saying the wrong thing. Like it or not, we're social beings and we do want to fit in. And sometimes we do this by keeping our mouth shut until we feel safe to speak. So how do we exhibit social courtesy bias? Well, it's simply we wait for someone else to speak first before we say anything. Have you ever been on one of those kind of like either a meeting or a group phone call and somebody asks for people's opinions or an answer and then nobody says anything? Just this dead, awkward silence. And sure, one of the reasons for the pause may be that you don't have an opinion to express, but it's also likely that people are afraid to be the first to speak. Again, they don't want to seem foolish by saying the wrong thing. So I have a great way to combat courtesy bias in a brainstorming session. And by that I mean where you have a group of people standing around a whiteboard, each with a Sharpie marker in one hand and a pad of Post-it notes in the other. And you're gonna come up with as many ideas as possible. And this process, and I'm going to talk through, also helps the introverts in the room who may not feel comfortable speaking out in a group setting. First, you have to lay out some ground rules and make sure that you make a comfortable environment for contradictions. These ground rules like all ideas are welcome. We're not shooting anything down at this point. Quantity over quality. No analysis. You know, those kinds of rules. After you lay down the ground rules, then you go through this process. You have everyone write down ideas in silence, and that in whatever time box, 2 to 5 minutes, whatever that might be. Write down in silence. And then once everybody's done their brainstorming, then they put the Post-it notes on the wall in silence. And then finally, once everybody's got their notes on the wall, that's the time for the group discussion. That's the time where you might see somebody else post it and add another one because it's prompted an idea. By doing this, having these stages of silence at the beginning, you're giving the group the opportunity to all write their true thoughts. And they're not being distracted by what somebody might be saying. By somebody stating a word, everybody can start thinking of that and lose the ability to really freely brainstorm. So the benefit is that working in silence is that it levels the playing field. You give people who do not normally feel comfortable talking in a group the opportunity to get their thoughts out. And they get to do this before all the chatty people come in and start making all this noise. I feel like this is a really important first step for any idea generating session. Also, it's a great way to avoid courtesy bias among the group, right? Okay. So let's talk about how our perceptions may have been influenced by things we've seen recently as opposed to things from a long time ago. The first one I want to talk about is the BaaderMeinhof Effect. Yes, that's a big word, so I'm going to repeat it again. BaaderMeinhof Effect. And this is also known as the frequency illusion. And this is the cognitive bias that happens when something that we've seen recently and it comes into our attention, it suddenly seems like it appears everywhere. So like you feel like you've seen some famous person in the news and they're on your local news and the national news and on your Twitter feed and on LinkedIn and Facebook and funny, they weren't in your mind yesterday, but now they seem to be everywhere. Or like this example, I heard somebody talking yesterday, a couple days ago, about how global warming, and they said, you know, regardless of how you feel global warming, this person said, well, global warming definitely is a thing because every day in January has been well above average. Well, to be fair, we're not even all the way through January yet. So that can't be fully true. So why does this happen? Well, our brain has to make sense of things. It can't help it. And sometimes in doing that, it makes patterns to quickly jump to a conclusion. So at this image here, you probably see 3 circles. You see a red circle, a yellow-green circle, and a purple-blue circle. But what this really is these are like little leafy looking things, little individual objects just put into a shape. Just happens to make a circle. So our brain really likes to make patterns for us. And when our brain also seeks things it's comfortable with and latches onto those, like in this case, a pattern. And thus, it ignores other things it's not familiar with. So when a pattern or a name rings true to us, our brain latches onto it. And as a result, we tend to think we see or hear it more than we actually do. So let's talk about a real world example. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere, it's winter, and you feel like getting a green sweater. And so you've got this idea that you're going to buy a green sweater. Now that you have this idea, you feel like everybody else has a green sweater. It's like it seems to be everywhere. Or is it? And so I want you to think about when someone makes the claim that this happens all the time, or all of our users do this. Take that claim with a grain of salt. My main point is to recognize that trends might not actually be as frequent as the person is stating. It might just be in their mind. Have you ever seen a person ride a scary ride and like scream the entire time? Screaming in sheer terror that they might be like they're being murdered. But when they get off that ride, they're totally overjoyed and they're stoked and they're ecstatic and they're ready to go on that ride again. Has anybody ever seen that? Well, this is known as the peak end rule. People judge an experience largely based on how they feel at the peak or the end of an experience. So in the case of this ride, the person is probably feeling the relief, joy that the ride is over and that they survived it. And they've probably forgotten about the sheer 2 minutes of terror that they were screaming like a little kid. So let me illustrate this with a story. My husband and I were in a restaurant where their menu was on a tablet or iPad, and there were not printed menus. I was watching him order a meal on an iPad tablet for some research I was doing on a product. He has a gluten-free diet, and so he needs to order special items like a gluten-free hamburger bun or a gluten-free pizza crust. And there's some other dietary ingredients that he needs to be aware of before ordering. I watched him struggle go through that menu on that tablet. He was clicking all over the place, hunting, pecking, searching. He griped, he scoffed, he sighed. It was actually kind of fun to watch. But eventually he found the gluten-free bun for his hamburger. The French fries, they said they were gluten-free, and he placed his order. After ordering, he said, well, that was easy enough. He'd already forgotten about all the pain he had just been through. For him, the peak of the experience was finishing the task and being done. And that was positive for him. So therefore, the whole experience was positive. So as we talk about the peak end rule, I want to take an opportunity to plug the importance of one of my favorite types of user research, and that's ethnographic observation, which is also known as side-by-sides. So ethnographic observation is when you are with a participant and observe what they do. You're there side by side with them. So maybe you sit at them while they're working at their desk, and you can, when doing that, you can observe, like, what does their workspace look like? What kind of cheat sheets do they use? What programs do they have open? How do they switch in between those programs? How do they interact with other people while they're working? Those kinds of things. Or like these photos here, I was down on Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles where I was doing some research for a product. I was observing and talking to tourists to learn about how they research tourist attractions in the area. The point here is that you're watching them go through the activity and picking up on those clues that you would only see in person. People are likely to report things differently after the fact than what really happened. They might not tell you about their struggles, but if you're there, you can see them firsthand. So why is ethnographic research so important? Well, think about the story I just told you about my husband and having to order from that gluten-free menu. You can take a person by what they say. You can't always take a person by what they say, but you can by what they do. So I know a lot of today's talk has been focusing on the negative aspects of cognitive bias. And that's because they're pretty bad. And I want everyone to be aware of these important fallacies so you can do better designs, you can be a better researcher, and you can be a better product partner. But you can use the traits of cognitive biases for good as well. Note that positive is the key here. We're not going to create any dark patterns, are we, folks? So remember how I talked about the BaaderMeinhof or the frequency illusion effect earlier? Again, that's the cognitive bias that happens when something that's recently come into our attention seems to appear everywhere. Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can use that comfort and familiarity to guide a user through a journey more smoothly. You can repeat elements, like especially in an omni-channel experience. And when I'm talking about omni-channel, that's where a person might interact with your product on multiple touch points. They may start their shopping experience at home on their desktop computer. Then they go into the store. And while they're in the store, they open the app or the website and do some additional research on the store. That person is coming into touch with your company or product in many different ways. As a UX designer, you can use these familiar clues like colors, fonts, branding, logos, and common design patterns to make the user feel more comfortable with where they are. This helps them feel comfortable in the overall experience. So, has anyone here in our meeting today ever assembled a piece of furniture you bought from Ikea? Think about how that makes you feel. Do you feel frustrated, accomplished, satisfied? I know that I feel like a champion when I put something together from Ikea. I have to admit though, I've even had some furniture that was a little less than perfect, like what this woman put together here. Whether you love it or hate it, there's even a cognitive bias associated with the famous blue and yellow Swedish box door. The Ikea effect is the tendency for people to place high value on objects they partially assembled themselves, just like furniture from Ikea, regardless of the quality or the end result. So why is this a thing? People have an emotional investment when they build something from their own blood, sweat, and tears. So how does this affect user experience design? Well, a user can experience that same effect when they complete a task, like assembling a puzzle or finishing a game. They feel a stronger emotional connection with that product when they help complete it successfully. So consider this feeling when you build an interface or a product that you could perhaps give the user a taste of delight after their success. So hopefully you've maybe found a couple things I've said today a little bit funny. Give me a break, okay? I tried to inject some humor along the way. And I've done that because I know that humorous items are more easily remembered than non-humorous ones. And this is known as the humor effect. So this is an easy one. We've all seen something funny on the internet, right? I really like this error or 404 page. You get to choose which developer gets fired for this error message coming up. All in light fun. When a company shows something funny, it allows users to connect with your company or product on a more personal and emotional level. Humor feels more conversational or relatable, and it gives your site or product that human connection. So how can you inject some humor into your site or product? Well, first, you simply want to decide how you want to do it. Is it going to be through words, through illustrations, through animations? There's a lot of ways that you can inject humor. But I do have one caveat about humor. And that is that you need to make sure that it's appropriate for your audience and represents the message your company wants to send. Do not be inappropriate. Remember, we're using these cognitive biases for good, right? Okay, let's move on to another example of a cognitive bias that could be used to benefit you in your designs. I'm just going to let this image sit here for a second because there is a lot going on. Ugh, I can't even, yeah. This image is crazy. In a world where everyone seems to be trying to one-up the next guy, people have to get more creative and extreme to capture your attention. What this means is that bizarre material is sometimes remembered better than common material. And this is where the bizarreness effect kicks in. This is part of the reason why humans and animals have peripheral vision. We notice things on the move, and we notice things that are different. So this seems like a pretty simple cognitive bias, right? We just make everything shocking, huh? Well, not really. There's a lot going on here. The whole point here is that you want your website or product or whatever to stand out in a sea of sameness. But you also don't want to be obnoxious and annoying. You can use design elements like color, contrast, emphasis to make something stand out. This is why you often see buttons on a page are a different color from the other items on a page. You can also use animation to draw attention to something. And finally, like I mentioned before, you can use humor, like a fun illustration, to play into this bizarreness effect. The key is to balance between pleasantly surprised and obnoxious as heck. And finally, I'm going to wrap up the ways that you can use cognitive biases for good with a very important one that we often take for granted. If you do nothing else in the universe as a UX designer or person involved in making stuff, please do this one thing. Make good defaults. Like this nice and tidy room here. When a person comes into your product for the first time, have things set up nicely for them. The default effect happens when we are given a set of options. We assume the default options are the best ones. We expect good things already to be chosen for us, and we don't have to do anything to set them. Say, for example, when you install an app on your phone, you assume that the push notifications are turned off automatically. If not, you find out the hard way that they're actually turned on by default as soon as you're bombarded with a bunch of useless messages. Ugh, I've been there. It's very frustrating. As a user, you assume the expert, or at the very least, the creator of the app, has vetted out the best design decisions for you. And that's what's automatically set in motion. When given a choice between several options, people have a tendency to favor the default one. Humans are lazy. Tell us what the best selection is. Like the famous words of the author Steve Krug, don't make me think. So how can you design products to promote good defaults? Well, part of it is to keep the marketing the sales department out of the designing a feature business. Let's be honest. They often want to plug things into an app for a different agenda than the user wants. They are promoting what the business wants. Don't let them throw in a bunch of features in there that users don't really need. Sometimes these suggestions are really just contributing to feature bloat. But really, what's a practical way that you can design good defaults? Well, it's to conduct user research and understand how the person normally uses your product and align the defaults to that. So how is this done in design? Well, like this package here, you use color and fonts and group like items together to emphasize this is the best option. You can see this one has a green bar on the top and a little drop shadow to make it look raised. This signifies that this is the best option that you should buy. And packaging items in a visual way will give the user confidence that you're presenting the right choice to them. That is, of course, if you actually are presenting the right option. Remember, we're going to do good with our designs. So to conclude, I want to revisit a few of the major points we talked about today. We've talked about how biases affect everyone, like the blind spot bias, and how we need to be careful when we're acting as a researcher not to lead the witness. We talked about the need to avoid things like the Semmelweis Effect and to be open to different and outside ideas. We also discussed our human need to fit in with the group, like the cognitive bias, the courtesy bias. We also talked about how our memory can be skewed when we think something we've seen recently, like in the BaaderMeinhof effect, makes us think we're seeing something all the time. And then finally, we talked about some ways to turn that frown upside down and use cognitive biases for good in our designs. Now, the things we talked about today are just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many more cognitive biases out there than what we covered today. But I think we've hit on some of the major ones that you can easily take away with you today. The main point here is I want you to be aware that they exist and to look for the signs of them in yourself and in others. And hopefully, knowing what they look like, you can keep them out of your future designs and discussions. I want you to go out there and build better products without bias. Thank you very much.